So, welcome to our session on the pandemic and the post-COVID economy, which is obviously an issue of immense importance to everybody. And I'm very happy to be joined by two very distinguished policy economists who have a real expertise in this area. Anne Case of Princeton, who is known for an enormous amount of writing, but perhaps for the wider public, best known for the work she did, which was seminal on falling life expectancy of non-college educated white people in America, which was subsequently appeared in some very important articles, co-authored with Angus Deaton, her husband, and a book called Deaths of Despair, which I think is one of the most important books of economic policy written by anybody in the last decade, and that has relevance to other countries, including, unfortunately, Britain. And also Tim Besley of the Oxford and now the London School of Economics, who's a very distinguished economist and sort of one of the rediscoverers, if you like, of political economy. So we have two genuine experts to talk about this immensely important topic. So just to remind us, if we needed reminding, we are still very much in the middle of a pandemic. And I think it's fair to say that the impact of this pandemic has shocked most people as part of the, this is obviously true socially, but it's also true economically. As part of my writing on this, I went back to look at some really expert forecasts of what a pandemic like the Spanish flu might do to our economies. And these were produced by the Congressional Budget Office in the US and by the European Commission. And what was interesting is their forecasts of the economic impact were dramatically smaller than it turned out to be, even though they assumed a disease with the impact of the Spanish flu. And so far as I can see, this is based on very uncertain knowledge, because we don't really know how many people the Spanish flu killed. But at the moment, it looks as though the death rate from this pandemic we're now experiencing is a couple of orders of magnitude smaller than that of the Spanish flu, given, of course, the enormous increase in human population. So we have discovered that pandemics really do incredible things to us. And of course, this comes along after this very important discovery that life expectancy is sort of peaking. So illness, disease, epidemics turn out to be unbelievably important policy events for everything, including the economy. So let me start then with the pandemic. How do you evaluate the nature of its impact on the economy and society in the US, and what we have learned about ourselves, which has surprised you? In the way we've responded, both for good and for bad? How do you see this, Anne?
That's a really good question. I think as far as sort of the social and economic effects of the pandemic, I have to start with the fact that in the US, about 16 million people lost their jobs at the start of the pandemic, which is an enormous loss. But simultaneous to that in the US, a very large fraction of people also lost their health insurance and this just highlights in yet a new way, the insanity of tying health insurance to employment, which we do in the US. So we don't have a number on the number of people who are actually now uninsured, because that's hard to come by. Some people who lost their insurance were able to pick it up through a family member, or might have been eligible for Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act. But it's safe to say that probably 10 million people lost their insurance, and they may have had as many yet again dependents. So here we have a body of people who not only lost their jobs, but also then are at risk of very, very high medical bills. It's interesting and a little surprising to me that the press has said so little about what this crisis has done in terms of people paying medical bills. I mean, one silver lining I'm hoping will come out of the epidemic is that enough people in the US are suddenly going to look at the way that we fund our healthcare system and say, we need to make a change. In addition to that, though, in the US, this threw into stark relief the fact that the US has become a two-class society, right? There are the haves and the have-nots. The haves are the people who went to college. In the US, that would be a 4-year degree. And then there are the 2/3 of adults in America who didn't. The haves are like me, right? I'm able to work from home. I didn't lose my job. I complain about the amount of Zooming I have to do. And I have a fairly cushy quarantine followed by, it will be recovery. But for the have-nots, they either are risking their lives by being on the front lines, or they've risked their livelihoods because they've lost their jobs. So that has become an even larger problem. And I just want to say one other thing, which is that it also shows the extent to which Americans don't trust their government. That's something that we've written about, that maybe a majority of people think the system is rigged against them. So when word came down from on high that they should wear masks and they should socially distance, and now that they should get vaccines, there's a lot of pushback because people just don't trust the messenger.
And presumably it's because of this distrust that what we think of as the obvious thing, namely universal health insurance, which must be immensely strengthened by this experience, because one consequence of what you describe is that people have to keep their jobs, because if they don't have health insurance. So even if they fear they're ill, or even if they are ill and therefore might be spreading it, they're obliged to go to work, which is a danger for everybody. And that you would think would make everybody say, hell, we really have to provide them with health insurance so they can stay at home and not spread the disease.
Yes.
But so big is the mistrust of government, the distrust of government, that connection doesn't seem to be even made by somebody who I just been reading today is regarded by many as just about the most left-wing president you've had since FDR. Isn't this really rather weird?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is also that the healthcare system in the US is so complicated that people oftentimes will look at a bill, they'll say, this is really complicated. Then they shrug and they go off and do something else. But now with probably 1 million people, again, we don't have a solid number here, but 1 million people being hospitalized and coming home then with probably tens of thousands of dollars worth of bills that they cannot pay. It's actually possible now that instead of it being something just on the hard left who talk about real reform, people in the middle of the distribution are suddenly going to be talking about real reform. At least that's the hope.
Now, Tim, what is interesting to me in listening to this is that we have, of course, a completely different health system, and nobody should be worrying about that. Obviously, in many ways, a different society. But if you think about the social impact of the disease in terms of who's been adversely affected by it, you think of the death rates, you think of the behavior that has propagated the disease. Britain and America really look rather similar in this way. So rather strikingly so, indeed, the death rate is higher here. and we've certainly spent a lot in supporting people, just staggering amounts. So what are the differences and the similarities? And what should we learn in Britain from this experience?
As you point out, Martin, the fact that we've had a socialized system of healthcare provision has not in any way, shape, or form made what our experience of this less shocking. It's manifested itself in different strains, and I think in the future the challenges that Anne was just referring to will come home to roost in terms of how we choose to fund that health system going forward and what structural changes we might want to make to respond to that. I think the thing that the focus I would share with Anne is we've got to get below the aggregates. I mean, sometimes people start quoting, how much GDP has fallen or any such number, but really the story is told by beginning to drill down below those numbers and realize exactly like you say that people have been differentially affected. Anne talked about in particular the differences according to the kind of occupations and the options for working at home. But we also know there are big differences, gender differences, and caring, particularly as they manifest themselves, and caring responsibilities. There will be, as we pull out of this, really big sectoral differences, I suspect, in the rate of recovery across the economy. And as you say, we've chosen, which is somewhat different to the US, to have cushioned the blow through a furlough system, which supports somewhere around 9 million workers. I don't recall the sort of up-to-date number, but has meant that to some extent we're postponing certain kinds of adjustments that certainly will have to happen in the end and may result in higher unemployment that really plays out in very different ways across the economy. So for us, there are huge challenges. And I was also struck in something else that Anne said, this issue of trust and government, I think is something quite common across the two countries' experience, that while there've been, particularly recently in the vaccination program, something of a triumph for government, at many points in the process, I think it's been very difficult for people to feel wholly confident that in the kinds of advice that have been given at different points. There'll be debates about, did we lock down fast enough, too slowly? Is often what people think, but those issues will have a lasting impact, I think. Although I just say one more thing on this. It's interesting when we look back at big events. You talked about Spanish flu, but people will often talk about the impact of the Second World War and the impact that had on society and the sense of perhaps communal values. There's a real question of which turn this is going to take. Is it going to take a turn towards a kind of reinvigorated sort of togetherness that says we've been through an event where many people have paid a price and we need to pull together? Or is this just going to lead to more and more fragmentation? I think is one of the very big questions moving forward.
Yes, I should perhaps say to those watching that I think you all have the opportunity to pose questions, and if possible, I will ask them later on in the discussion. But let's go on from that, and there's just a few more precise questions. I have to say, and that's my fault, that I was astonished by the reaction to the disease, and I think in a way that I think our policymakers were, perhaps more in Britain than in America. But I didn't think we would close down so much of our economy. I didn't really realize that so many of us, the lucky ones, would be able to work from home so smoothly. That was really quite a surprise. And the result, of course, is many were cushioned and many were also thrown to the wolves. So I was really interested. So perhaps I'll start with you, Anne. What have been the biggest surprises to you about how we've responded and what's happened to us in the last year? And then I want to go on and look at the future and the lessons. What do you feel? What is the sort of big, because what you discussed before, you know, the American health system is what it is, and it has the consequences it has. One sort of might have predicted. But it's the politicization of the masks. Is that a big surprise? Is the fact that so many people stayed at home?
It's a huge surprise to me, the politicization of the masks. I was reading last night a piece that was written where they interviewed 7 people who had made movies about contagion or about, you know, viruses spreading. And almost to a person, that was their biggest surprise as well, that why do we have to take this mask and make it into a political statement when it can save lives? I'll have to say I was also happily surprised by the passage of the $1.9 trillion relief bill that's just been signed into law, because I'm hoping that's a sign of a better day. It's actually going to reduce poverty in America. It may actually reduce inequality in America in a pretty profound way. Now, whether this is all the Biden administration can hope to do in the future, well, a lot still remains to be seen. But I think that just the fact that it has passed and people who didn't vote for Biden are actually going to benefit from it may lead us to the world that Tim was talking about. Maybe we come out of this together. I mean, I think part of the polarization just comes from the fact that people didn't and don't have good jobs. I think if you offered them good jobs, we would see the polarization melt a bit.
So you have a bad surprise, the politicization of masks, and the good surprise, you've got what I would regard as a less insane administration. That's a very good one. Tim, so what have your surprise? Do you have a bad surprise and a good surprise? I think it's very useful often to focus on things we've learned, which are really quite astonishing.
Yeah, well, I do. I actually do have a bad surprise, a good surprise. The bad surprise is I'd never really thought about the vulnerability of the interconnected world we live in to this kind of event. I mean, there are certain things, and that you mentioned, Martin, that we've learned to live without very quickly. I mean, I've barely been on an aeroplane for a year, and I seem to spend most of my life on it before that. And if you said to me that I would be deprived of air travel, I would have been really shocked at that idea. But actually, it's not so bad after all that we don't spend so much time in airports. So, but the vulnerability to an event like this. But on the other hand, I've been surprised by resilience of many different kinds. I mean, one example, which I think I would never have anticipated, is the design of our furlough scheme that was conceived of and implemented in an incredibly short period. I don't think we, at least in recent history, I can think of such a major protective measure implemented by government at such speed that has had so much impact on people's lives. So we've learned that we are quite resilient. I think we're going to learn that in the recovery, by the way. I think there are parts of the economy that have suffered mightily, as we know. But I think we'll also see a certain amount of resilience that we might not have understood was there. And that's why it's a surprise, because we might have thought that these shocks were going to be things that would floor government, that they couldn't design a transfer program like the furlough scheme in a matter of weeks. But no, they actually did it, and they rolled it out, and it was, it's never perfect, but it was pretty effective, I would argue.
So, Anne, perhaps we should now return and then get to a broader context to what we need to do differently. Okay, we've gone through this. We've been told a lot of things which are important, vulnerability to a pandemic. Good to know that. And we've learned how unequally the opportunity to cope with it is spread, and therefore how unequal the consequences are for our society. It's underlined. Inequalities have made them visible. So if you look at the US, if you had your dreams, And in the US, in the world, the US is a leader of the world. And one of the things we've learned is, well, surprise, surprise, a pandemic is a global event. If somebody's got it somewhere, it tends to arrive in our country, doesn't it? Very quickly. It's staggeringly quickly. So what are one or two really big things we've got to change now that we've experienced this?
Well, in the US, for example, obviously the healthcare system is number one. But I think that many people don't connect the dots between the fact that the US healthcare system, which is $1.05 goes to the healthcare industry in the US. $1.05. That's twice what most countries in Europe spend on their healthcare. And it costs jobs for people at the bottom. So if I'm an employer and I'm looking at a $21,000 premium for a family policy, I'm going to shed my low-wage workers. They're just not worth that amount of money to me. And so we end up with this system where we have this pool of outsourced labor whose wages have been falling for 50 years now. So as the healthcare costs rose, median wages for men since 1979 have been on a long downward trend, as has attachment to the labor market. And a lot of knock-on effects, social dysfunction that comes from that gives way to the kind of thing that Angus and I have been working on, which is people have to soothe the beast with something. And some people soothe it with ice cream, some people soothe it with alcohol, some people soothe it with drugs. And that we need to find some way of providing better opportunities for people at the bottom. That has got to change in the US. Unfortunately, after the vaccines are well distributed and we're hopefully looking at COVID in the rearview mirror, we're still looking at 165,000 Americans every year taking their lives from suicide, drugs, and alcohol. So and we think that reform of the healthcare system and trying to get a control on prices there actually has a big effect on the low-wage labor market. And the other part is something that my friend Danny Roderick has been talking quite a lot about, which is, globalization. Like the pie gets bigger, and no one really talks about the fact that the way that pie is distributed is a lot for me and very little for you. So in fact, less than you ever had before. So I think that globalization, in part for national security reasons, that we need to be able to make our own protective equipment. We need to be able to mass produce what's needed in these sorts of times. And that our supply chains became so interwoven that we've lost that capacity. So I'm kind of big on the fact that we may have let the reach of our globalization go a little too far, and that we need to pull back on that somewhat.
So, Tim, that's a nice challenge. Since you're a development economist and probably like me think development was greatly helped by globalization, and think it was basically because the Americans completely screwed up their welfare policy, their health policy, their corporate governance policies. I'm writing a book about all this. But anyway, that's quite a good challenge. So should we really fundamentally rejig the way we approach the world economy to deal with these sorts of threats? Perhaps in addition, we should just travel less and accept that we're going to be more isolated because these pandemics are so threatening and they travel so easily in our interconnected world. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it raises very big questions about the nature of and sustainability of different forms of global cooperation. I mean, we were not living in a world, at least in the last few years, which was particularly propitious for global cooperation. And this is a reminder. I think it would be hard to say that the pandemic was entirely due to that, but it's got to make us rethink in a serious way what kinds of global institutions we need. I would argue there's a sort of golden period in the post-Second World War period where there was a belief in a certain vision of the global system, which led, of course, to the setting up of the Bretton Woods institutions. And that system sort of lost its way, partly because the kind of model that underpinned that, I think, was thrown open by the experience of globalization and what that was teaching us. Did it lead us to think that we didn't have to have as much actual global cooperation? Each country was more or less just opening its borders, and that was sufficient. I think we've learned that does need rethinking. The main concern, of course, would be that we retreat into a form of nationalism, and we've seen some signs of that already. I mean, some of the debates, even within Europe, about vaccine nationalism. There's a danger that that's a precursor of what's to come when people start to think that they can't trust the global system any longer to deliver medicines and other things. So I do worry that the corollary of this will be a sort of greater form of nationalism that will be to the detriment of certain parts of the world, because they won't be able to break into markets that are potentially going to be valuable sources of poverty reduction. So for sure, there's a huge challenge coming down the track, and I think global leaders have a massive responsibility over the next few months to sort of set us on a track that will probably determine whether there can be a realistic greater form of global cooperation that could potentially head off any future pandemics like this.
I mean, if you follow that up, we can have a sort of debate about how much you should produce at home, how self-sufficient you should be, and in what. But you'd have to recognize that a great many countries, I mean, America is, of course, unique. America's like China. It can obviously produce a lot of itself, but most countries, certainly most small countries, cannot ostensibly produce everything for themselves. So there clearly has to be a way of allowing integration. And vaccines are a perfect example. I mean, the truth is, if you look at this crisis, an extraordinarily small number of countries actually have been able to develop vaccines. And if we have vaccine nationalism, that has two consequences, which are pretty obvious. One, the most important of which is that lots and lots of people will never get them. And if lots and lots of people never get them, you're then confronted with a pandemic, which even 100 years ago, indeed 600 years ago, we know pandemics were global events. The Black Death is a perfect example. So responding to a pandemic by saying, well, we're all going to be nationalists seems sort of crazy to me. And even more when we always have the climate change thing and everybody realizes this is serious. So it would be, to me, terribly depressing if the consequences of a huge global event was for us all to decide that we must all sort of close down and become inward looking. But that seems to me exactly what's happening. So that in a way, to me, is the most frightening consequence of this. What is your view on this, Anne?
There's a lot of room between being totally open and being totally closed, right? But I think that we need to be smarter and in thinking about what needs to be done at home in case something like this happens again. It's also the case that the US could do a lot more within its own borders to try to make the benefits of a global economy work for everybody here. And that has not happened. We could make it happen, at least in theory, but whether it does happen, not so clear. I mean, I think there's a part of me that thinks I owe more to the people within my own borders. We vote together. We set up a system together. I think I owe more to the people here than I owe to people elsewhere, but that doesn't mean I don't owe anything to people elsewhere. So I think it's a balance that we need to try to debate in democracies. That's what I think we try to do. and figure out how we want to set up the playing field.
Actually, Danny Roderick, since you mentioned him, has this argument, which I think is quite attractive, which is the more open you are, the more successfully open you are. And his famous example, like everybody's favorite example is Denmark. It always ends up with Denmark. The bigger and more effective a welfare state you have. And isn't it fair to say, Tim, that though our state has done a lot, it's also revealed some pretty big holes in what we're able to protect people against? And so one of the things one might want to do in the aftermath of this, not just in the US where it's obvious, is actually go back and look at, do we need to modernize or even possibly revolutionize our welfare arrangements to make sure that we can bear these sorts of burdens in an equitable way and cope with and also gain the benefit of future opportunities and adverse shocks better?
I think that I agree with that, Martin. I view it as even slightly deeper than the reform of the welfare state. It's about the nature of the social contract that exists between the state and the citizens, and the responsibilities on both sides. Now, there's one feature of the British system that in a sense led to the furlough system, was the fact that we don't have a meaningful system of unemployment insurance. We haven't for a long time. We've concentrated on a system of income support and an income floor, but we haven't really thought of this in insurance terms. So we've taken a particular turn, and I do think now is the time to rethink that, because there's lots of implications that follow from thinking about the state as an insurance contract with the citizens, rather than just a machine that just makes transfers, particularly to people in times of need, because they don't quite see it in the life cycle perspective. My sadly departed colleague John Hills wrote a very interesting book on this a few years ago, on the fact that if we view the welfare state in life cycle terms, in some ways it's a lot less redistributive than it looks at a point in time, and that people have to think of it as part of this wider social contract. So I've absolutely no doubt that in Britain, where we've taken a turn, that turn needs to be at least reconsidered, and I would say unemployment insurance should be something back on the agenda. Whether we'll end up going down that road, I don't know, but it would have given us another way of dealing with what we had to do with the furlough system, have we got a system in place. Of course, it would have looked a lot more like the US. We'd probably have had much bigger increases in unemployment because we wouldn't have been paying to preserve people's jobs, but it's something that does need to be reconsidered, I feel.
So this would be more back to Bismarck or Beveridge, instead of what one might call the poor law, going back to the poor law approach to what the state is trying to do, which might be a not entirely unfair description of the way the British system has evolved. One would have to say in the US case, it's such a confusion by now, and it's difficult to get the sense. But is that really what you're saying? We need to go back to social insurance? Tim?
Sorry, I wasn't sure that was me. Yeah, I mean, I think the watchword here is reciprocity. That what really united, I mean, we often think it's Bismarck or Beveridge because there were differences in the scheme, but the key principle that united both of them was the notion that you build this on the back of some kind of reciprocity. You make contributions to the state in order to be a recipient from the state. And I do think it's exactly as you say, it's going back to a system fundamentally based on principles of reciprocity that that's the nature of the debate that we should have, I think.
Would you agree, Anne, with that framing of the social contract implications of a crisis like this and what it's shown that we can't really do?
Yeah, and that seems to only be possible, though, if people trust that system.
Yes.
Right? And so that's where the building, I think, needs to take place. I wanted to go in a slightly different direction, because I think in both the US and in the UK, one of the things that we're going to have to deal with is that labor has lost its voice. That the breakdown of unions, the shattering of unions, the fact that labor no longer has a seat at the table. And as everyone says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think one of the reasons that the stock market is skyrocketing in the US is that capital understands right now that it has an even stronger hand relative to labor. So I think that some of the ills and some of the distrust come from the fact that people feel that there's no way they can get ahead. There's no way that their children will be able to thrive. And we need to figure out a way. I'm not sure that unions are the way, and I know there's a lot we can say about what unions do or did in the past that wasn't what we would necessarily like to see, but they did a lot of things well. They protected labor, they protected jobs, they protected wages, and we need to find some way to rebuild that contract as well between capital and labor.
Well, we have some series of 3 questions from one questioner, which actually brings this together and allows us, I think, perhaps to conclude. So perhaps each of you can devote a minute or we don't have much more time. Okay, we've spent what seems an incredibly large amount of money. We've accumulated a lot of debt. We're going to accumulate a lot more. We have very large deficits. We think we need to refurbish the welfare state, the social compact in some way, make society fairer. That would seem to me, among other things, in the case of the UK and US, given where they are, to imply higher taxes on the successful and the wealthy. So let's start with you, Tim, and then let Anne the other. Can we afford all this? Is something terrible going to come down the road? Defaults, inflationary funding, I don't know, huge increases in taxes? Or should we actually say that's exactly where we should go? Wealth taxes, I don't know. And perhaps Anne would also consider whether there are things about this we should consider either terribly frightening, as many people say, or tremendous opportunities to change everything. So, Tim.
Well, I almost agree with everything the questioner, the premises behind the question, until you got to say taxing the rich more. And that's not because I have I'm carrying any particular brief for the rich. I think the thing we've done in Britain is to forget that we really need broad-based taxation to fund anything like a proper welfare state. So that's the old adage that we want Scandinavian public services on the US tax system.
Indeed,
and we've never found a way of reconciling those conflicting demands. So we have to get real about the fact that we won't be able to tax the rich to fund the kinds of public service and welfare state that we would all like to enjoy. There has to be a really collective approach to funding. And that's part of rebuilding that social compact. People realizing that, as they do, I think, rather well in Scandinavia, that you have to pay high levels of taxation to support that. What the form of that taxation will take, I mean, there is a role potentially for one-off wealth taxes, but I just don't think wealth taxes have proven over history to be a very effective way of doing this. And Sweden's abolished its wealth tax. That's not to say we should follow Sweden in all things, but I think that's indicative of the difficulties.
So, Anne, the last words. Looking at the US, can they afford all this debt and all the rest of it? And are they going to need to pay a lot more tax? And if so, who's going to pay it?
Currently, I think it's not the time to worry about the debt. This is the time for us to figure out how we get back up on the rails. It's also the case that interest rates are so low at this point. I know that can change, but they're so low at this point. This is the time that we should be spending. We should be rebuilding infrastructure. We should be investing in children. We should be doing the things that we think will propel us through the 21st century. How we pay for it. I think the UK and the US are very different in this way. I think it's going to be that's going to be the real struggle, is to come up with a value-added tax that people would actually be willing to buy into, or increase the tax rates enough to pay for these things. I mean, one of the things Joe Biden had to step away from was this idea that somehow he was a socialist, right? And so we have a lot of work to do.
So I've got to end it here. I think we've had a wonderful conversation, and I think what really take away from this is that this shock is a tremendous shock in itself, but it's also raised some really deep questions about our future as societies, and we better try and answer them. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Anne and Tim, for a really enjoyable discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah.